So I'm going to start to talk about our flagship benchmark product, which is the Protein Producer Index. A little bit about the index. It is the most comprehensive assessment, ESG assessment, of 60 of the largest protein producers in the world. And we assess them with themes aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And these 60 companies have a combined revenue of over 520 billion US dollars. And we selected them due to their market cap and material exposure to the 5 main protein categories that we cover: the beef industry, dairy, pork, poultry and eggs, and aquaculture. And we assess the companies on 9 risk factors and 1 opportunity factors. And I will now show you a little bit about the methodology before I show you the actual tools for a bit more context. So on the tools page, there's also a summary of the methodology, but really, if you look at this right-hand side, it summarizes the factors that we assess the companies on. They range from greenhouse gas emissions on the climate side to nature-related ones like deforestation and water use and scarcity, as well as social-related KPIs like working conditions and food safety. We assess them on the different KPIs. So for instance, I'm going to zoom in a little bit on one of the factors, let's say the greenhouse gas emissions, under which we have 5 KPIs. And we have descriptions on the principles that we assess them on, including the sub-KPIs. And these are the type of information that we expect to find in the company's public disclosures. We give them scores, and then we aggregate the scores at the factor level to arrive at a certain risk score overall, to reflect how well they are managing these risks associated with their businesses. And if I then take you to the best practice section, this will give you some idea of what disclosure do we expect to see from the companies before we award them with the maximum score. Now I will take you to the actual tools. All right, in this tab called the company ranking, we are able to see, as I mentioned before, the risk scores associated with all of the 60 companies that we assess. We can toggle them by year. Can see the scores from last year to this year. We can also focus specifically, again, I'm using greenhouse gas emission as an example, on how these companies rank on the greenhouse emissions factor. We can even drill down further to see, again, if I focus on the scope 1, 2, and 3 target, on this specific KPIs, how companies fare. And there's also a filter function where we can filter by regions, proteins, or specific companies. So for instance, if I filter for the beef companies, it will only show companies where the main production of protein is beef, and we assess them on that supply chain. And you will see them listed again from high to low in this case. If we scroll down a little bit in the table section, we will see the list of the companies in table format, showing a bit of an overview of their market cap, the country that they're based, and their main protein, as well as this particular column where they actually provide company feedback to us or not. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, in the index assessment cycle, which happens every year, we do assess them on their publicly disclosed information. And once the draft assessment is done, we reach out to each company and share with them this draft assessment and give them an opportunity to give us feedback. The feedback can be, oh, you missed this document, so you should really be looking into this policy file that we have here, or to something more specific like this KPI is not really applicable to us because we don't operate in areas of water stress and things like that. But as you can see, if you toggle here on the heat map table, you'll be able to see again across for all of the companies, the different factors and how they fare. So even though the overall risk score is reflected, you're also able to see which particular factors they score better or worse at. Now I'm going to take you to a deep dive of each individual company. If we choose Marfrig, for instance, it will take you to the Marfrig company profile page. Again, you can download this page as a PDF at the top here. But in the overview, one is able to see, let's say in this spider diagram, a comparison of this year's score compared to last year's score and which areas they're improving on and or maybe not improving on. You can also compare them to the index best, for instance, in terms of the scores. And as you can see, the analysis breakdown is listed here. Again, zooming into the greenhouse gas emissions factor, where Marfrig scores 71, we are able to see the scores that we award them on each of the sub-KPIs underneath. Now, these are the qualitative assessments that the analysts glean from the company's disclosure. And we also list the sources that we get these assessments from, so that there is a reference trail, so to speak. And I just want to highlight here, we consolidate all of this downloadable resources related to Marfrig, the company, from their assessment, as well as the full data set where the scores are available in Excel format for downloading. This actually is quite popular among our members who want to use the scores and integrate it into their own internal ESG database. Finally, I want to take you through the comparison table. So if I take you back to the index tool page, we have quite a nifty comparison function whereby we can do comparisons at the company level. Let's pick again the biggest beef producers and meat packers. Minerva, perhaps, and Marfrig, where you can see them side by side, listed by risk scores as such. And that concludes my demo for the tool for now.
No, that's very cool. Yeah, and I've played with this a little bit, but I haven't gotten to as deep as Erica has. There's a lot of great information. It's just comparing things side by side, seeing which companies are doing better, what they're improving on, and that leads me to the question we talked about before that I'd like to get more. Or I'm sure people would like to get more information on is, how do you work with companies? Do companies reach out to you and complain about their scores, ask for changes? How does that process work? And how do they work to improve those? And I guess the second part of this question is from the other side. I'm curious about investors with the same, are investors asking for more information, those kind of things. So just how do companies see the tool and how do investors see the tool, I think, more broadly?
Yeah, those are very good questions. Let me answer the company side. On the company side, I briefly mentioned about our process of what I call company outreach as we assess them every year as part of the index. Definitely, companies do complain about, information not being captured, or
Right.
perhaps the scores are not reflective of other activities that they're doing. We always come back to the fact that our methodologies do align with other standards and frameworks that are already out there. We're not creating brand new KPIs, and we are very cognizant of this because we try not to add the reporting burden on companies. That's not the point here.
Right.
But then we do we take this opportunity, right, when they give us feedback to explain the reason why we pick these KPIs is because they are material issues. Our investors care about them. Our members do care, and they do want to know this level of detail, especially when they are entering into a stewardship and dialogues with the companies. It's sometimes not enough to just look at, do you have a target? But you kind of also want to see how the quality of the target that you set, are they aligned with SBTI and so on. So we find that dialogue actually helpful with companies. And over the past 6 years, since we launched the index for the first time, we have seen more and more companies moving out of the high risk category into more medium risk. So I think we do see that as, impact. Right? Companies are actually understanding where to report better. On the investor side, I think the feedback that we get is that they appreciate the level of details that we go into. Again, it's very helpful for stewardship activities, but also from a benchmarking perspective, it is quite unique in the sense that we focus on this subsector that is typically not really highlighted or included in other non-NGO benchmarks. And so the fact that we provide them downloadable Excels and are very, very open with the methodology to the KPI levels help them inform their own, portfolio models as such.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to have you on today is as you said, you guys have only been doing this for about 6 years or so. So it's new to a lot of analysts' minds, portfolio managers' minds, and companies' minds. So we hope this can be a little bit of a part of getting people to use this resource more. We have one other question. Does the greenhouse gas risk score take into account regional carbon pricing and regulation? Is that baked into the methodology for the risk?
No, the short answer is not really, because this KPIs are really a measure of the risk mitigations that each companies are disclosing in their reporting. So I think the regional carbon prices that would come into play more in the second tool I'm going to talk about, in the climate risk scenario analysis tool.
Okay. We had one other question that came in before we get to climate risk. Oh, wait, no, another one's come in. I apologize. Most of the companies you guys are looking at are big, multinational companies. How well does this apply to mid cap and smaller companies? And is that something you guys plan to expand upon as information becomes better?
That's a good question, because we have been asked a lot as to why we don't expand this to more than the 60 companies really that are the biggest. And to that, we say that we do have resources, and the fact that some of these KPIs, we convert them into what we call the company dialogue questions. This is a distilled version of the KPIs per factor with the topics, with an explanation of what best practice is in our standards, as well as examples that can be used by smaller cap companies and other companies beyond the 60, really, to help guide, in terms of the direction that they need to be at. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I think so. We're actually a little bit ahead of time, and questions are coming in. So I'm going to ask you one or
Mhm.
two more questions before we get on
Yeah,
to the
yeah.
climate risk tool. Can you tell us a little bit more about um, the quality of GHG inventory? Uh, are you able to collect the quality of the data and getting those GHG emissions?
More
Like, does that
around.
come from companies or and is it, and how are you able to get scope one, scope two, scope three is more rare or usually in a range? Just, yeah, I guess they're asking what's the quality of GHG inventory
Mhm.
in your mind, what you're getting from companies.
Yeah, for this group of companies that we are tracking, it's not good enough. I
Yeah.
think the short answer is unfortunately it's not good enough, which is the reason why we wanted to create the climate risk scenario tool is that we over the first few years of tracking the index, we just don't see enough disclosure, and when we do, the quality of inventory is really lacking. And again, we do ask companies to disclose not just on the facility level, but on the supply chain side as well, right? Their awareness on the animal feed side as well as the farms. And it's typically, they start with the facilities and stop there. They don't disclose methane emissions, which is quite material when it comes to animal farming. And so all of these details we are sadly lacking still.
Yeah, that's what I would expect. With
Mhm.
things like the CSRD just coming to effect, the CS Triple D, the laws in
Mhm.
California, SEC rule on climate just starting. This process is new for most companies and companies up and down their supply chain. So that's the answer I expected, and so I'm not surprised to hear that. All right, before we move on, more specifically to climate risk, we have one more.
Mhm.
Can you speak to the methodology used to calculating water scarcity risk scores? That's another very interesting uh,
Mm.
metric because we all know water is such a big part, especially in beef and dairy. A little bit about the methodology behind water, which isn't as well publicized as greenhouse gas emissions, but
Mm.
just as important.
Yeah, so on water scarcity, on the issue of water, really, we look at two areas. One is water stress and scarcity, and the other is sits under pollution, actually,
Mm,
which is water quality.
yep.
But we do work a lot with WRI, the World Resources Institute, in terms of understanding how they look at assessing water risk. So we do recommend to companies to look at their aqueduct tools. That's an online tool that WRI published to help do at least a water risk assessment, geolocation wise. And then from our end, we do assess the companies, again, starting from facilities and their understanding and management of water use and scarcity on the supply chain side, from feed farming and then the animal farming. And I'm just sharing the screen with you because it just list out really all of the sub KPIs that we're looking at. And again, the column that says best practice are really what can be achieved and what should be achieved when it comes to the different KPIs around water stresses. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I think so. And before we move into climate risk, there's just one more question that came up that we probably should
Mhm.
have covered earlier. Just who is the FAIRR database available to? Uh,
Ah,
Speak a little bit
yes.
about that.
So the FAIRR database is available to our members. Again, as I mentioned, we run an investor network and we have asset owners and asset managers as members. If you are an institutional investors, membership is actually free. It is not publicly available, unfortunately, the tools that we have. But in addition to, if they're in if eligibility is an issue, I just want to say that we are a collaborative network. And what that means is we are able to collaborate with non-investors. It just has to be a strategic partnership. And we have done that in the past where we work together in sort of understanding what the needs are, and we share and we collaborate on certain projects together. So feel free to reach out.
Yeah.
Great. I'll move on now to talk about our climate risk scenario analysis tool, and we call it the CRT, Climate Risk Tool for short. So a little bit about the CRT and why we created it. And again, I did say this earlier about the gap that we identified around how there is a lack of understanding, and even from a disclosure perspective, climate risk scenarios being conducted in the sector. And we do believe that this could pose a blind spot for investors if they are not really fully understanding the risk associated, especially to those that are exposed through their funds. So what CRT is? It's a scenario analysis tool that assesses the material impact of climate change on 40 of the biggest livestock companies. That is a subset of the protein producer index. So these are the livestock companies, meaning they don't include the aquaculture companies, just because the climate risk model for aquaculture protein is quite a bit different than the land-based ones. And it illustrates how the climate change will impact the profitability of these companies under 3 distinct climate scenarios based on IPCC and NGFS. And again, I want to say that this tool is quite unique because it is the first ever to simulate macro level climate risk implications and quantifies it financially at the company level. And we built it by having technical partnership with the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, which is a systems modeling expert based in Austria, so that we can ensure that we are capturing the systemic considerations that they have through their integrated land use model called the Globia model. Oh, thank you for the marking. So let me now take you to the methodology again, briefly, just to set the context. As you can see, we have the 3 different scenarios that is modeled: high climate impact, business as usual, and net zero aligned. And we also model them at 2 different time points, by 2030 and 2050. And as you can see on the right, is actually a nice diagram showing the flow of the model coming from the macro drivers at the top, and then the different revenue drivers and cost drivers. These 2 are considered as input as we combine them with the company level information, such as the revenues and the total cost increase, as well as the mitigation potential here, which is actually the ESG scores coming from the protein producer index. So essentially, if you have a higher risk score in the index, then your mitigation potential is quite low. And this will feed into the actual simulated revenue and net cost increase, which then is computed into profitability. And I will now, I guess, show you the different tabs that explains more about the assumptions under the macro drivers in the model. And even though this is not almost quickly apparent in the tools, we find that our members do find an explanation of these assumptions valuable, especially as it helps them with their understanding and developing their own specific modeling exercises. And these are some of the assumptions around carbon prices as well and feed prices. Now, I'm going to, without further ado, take you through the actual tool itself. Now the tool starts with a chart that shows the range, the percent change in the cost that is simulated. Again, all the three different scenarios, net zero align, BAU, high climate impact, which we can toggle and just see the different data points on, as well as the future time by 2030 or 2050. I'm just going to keep all scenarios on for ease so that we can look at the different ranges of all 40 companies, but we can also look at the models out of the EBIT margin for these different companies. We can simplify it to look at it by protein types as well in different categories, or for a macro level, and this is what the fixed income team usually like, is the regional view. And if I go back to all of the companies and to all of the costs, I may want to demonstrate it by zooming in on using the filters, maybe looking at the companies that we looked at before, JPS and Marfrig. Yeah, where we can see that under when we order it by range size, that the gap is or the ranges really is more positive for Marfrig than JPS when it comes to increase in costs. So there's more costs incurred, I think, under the high climate impact for the JPS and for Marfrig than JPS. And if you want to look at the further detail in terms of what contributes to that cost, we can look at the breakdown tab. And if we look at the companies and costs and maybe filter it again for JPS and Marfrig, we'll give investors a bit of a better idea of where the cost is coming from. As you can see, Marfrig and JPS are exposed to a lot of costs coming from carbon tax. And especially if we look at the high climate impact scenario, what's interesting here is that feed prices is going to be impacting JPS more than Marfrig when it comes to the cost increase in the future. And again, we can model this in 2030 or 2050. And finally, I guess in the download section, this is where I just want to point out that the model data is something that, as well as the technical annex, are the two areas that we see are quite popular that our investor members are downloading. Again, it's the discussions around the models and the assumptions that goes behind it that our members find quite helpful, because while the tools do illustrate impacts and is helpful for benchmarking, it's a top-down model, right? And investors do want to build things from the ground up, from the company perspective. And I think that's quite helpful to understand the assumptions that go behind the model. And I think that concludes my walkthrough for the tool for CRT. Back to you, Matt.
Oh, I muted myself. I almost started talking without unmuting myself. Before we get into questions, I have a quick question. Just if you could demonstrate, I'm curious about the heat stresses 2050, pulling up a couple of companies and just seeing 2030 versus 2050, just the range. And we saw a little bit, you showed one of them, but just to show how pronounced that difference is.
The 2030 versus 2050.
Yeah.
Right. So this is essentially the cost incurred under the high climate impact scenario 2030. And by 2050, you can see that it's, well, you remember that the dot that was at 40 and now it's hovering at 60.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. That's very interesting. All right. Again, we have a couple questions here, but please keep your questions coming, everyone. We touched on this a little bit earlier. Excuse me, I had a cough right as I was starting a question. My water. We touched on this a little bit about how investors use FAIRR. If you could tell us a little bit about the feedback you get from clients, what do they find most useful? Where do you see them spending most of their time? And then are there things they're looking for that isn't here yet, and you guys are working on to provide in the future?
Yeah. So I think to answer your question in terms of what our members find most helpful is again, the downloadable Excel with all of the assumptions and the scores underlying these numbers is quite helpful for them for their own analysis. But also, one of the feedback that we receive is that quite a lot of investors are trying to focus more on the regionality. So when they are looking at, let's say, certain regions, and oftentimes they do look at certain regions because they want to understand how to apply the climate strategy at a fund level by looking at it by region, because they don't necessarily want to do it company by company.
Right.
What their feedback was is they wish we'd had more data points per region to make it a bit more robust. And because we are starting with the 40 biggest, I think that sometimes brings to question as to, how robust is this range if we're going to look at an aggregate with only, let's say, 3 Latin American companies. And so an expansion is actually underway. We are trying to expand the universe for the climate risk tool for that reason.
Okay, great. I have 2 questions that have come up. They're a bit related, but you can answer them differently if you wish to. The first is more general on regulation. Regulation around sustainability on a lot of these issues is increasing in a lot of places. We mentioned that before. How do you see this trend developing? More regulation and impacting the data you have. You would expect higher quality data going forward. We talked about the challenges of getting good scope 1, 2, and 3 data. And what's in that regulation, in that data, what would you like to see the most? And then the separate question, which I'll hold off, I'll let you know, you can incorporate in that answer, or we can come back later, is what are the assumptions about carbon taxes, carbon prices you guys are building into the future when we look at 2050, when we look at 2030? So those 2 separate questions, but you can answer them how you wish or integrate them how you wish.
Okay. Maybe the regulations question first.
Sure.
I have to say that the improvement in the index scores, because they are based on public disclosures, has also been helped, right, by the increased sustainability disclosures as required by stock exchanges all over the world. But that's, it still varies by region. So as you can see, if you remember the chart from the index earlier, the lower scored companies tend to be in Asia. Because the regulation requirements around disclosure is just now strengthening with the adoption of TCFD in Hong Kong Stock Exchange, Shanghai Stock Exchange, and China specifically is now strengthening their ESG reporting requirement, which is great. They are also going to align, I think, with ISSB, which is they're heavily socializing currently in China. So that's good news. So in terms of the second question, I'm trying to remember what that was. What is it?
What are the assumptions about carbon taxes, carbon markets in the future, and how's that baked into the assumptions we see about 2050, especially into the future?
So on the carbon price, we are actually taking that assumption from the Globiome model, which is the systems model developed by EASA. Right now, the assumption that we are taking within our own model is that developing country is half of which the price that the developed country is going to be hit at, just from a national level. discussion, it is probably economically likely to happen that developing countries can't shoulder all of the same level of carbon tax. So that is the assumption that we made. But
Okay. Well, thanks you, Eric. Excuse me. Thank you for joining us. There's no more questions in the queue. If one appears, I'll let you know. But I want to thank everyone for coming today. If you're interested in reaching out to ourselves or FAIRR, you can find us on LinkedIn and social media. We can't hide. Feel free to reach out to us if you have questions that you didn't think of during this presentation, but you think of later. Feel free to reach out to us or FAIRR. Thanks again, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Erica, for your time. Take care, everyone. Have a good day.
You're welcome. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone.